So this is going to be our last video, and I'll just be covering things pretty quick. We're starting it with Emperor Valentinian from 364 AD to 375. He was emperor, and right away he made his brother Valens emperor of the East. Now Valentinian's first problems was the Alemanni. Now they were unhappy with the gifts that were sent to them by the new emperor, which were much smaller than what previous emperors sent, so they invaded Gaul. Now at the same time, there was an uprising which began in the east against his brother Valens. Valentinian received the news of both of these threats on the same day. Now Valentinian had to decide which area to fight in first, and the Gallic tribes had begged him to stay there and help them fight off the Alemanni. So he chose to stay in Gaul. Now mainly because he wasn't sure if Gaul supported him fully, so there was no better way to gain their support than to protect the nobility there. Now the Alemanni had pushed aside 2 Roman forces and pushed further into Gaul. Now in 366, they met at Chalons-sur-Marne. Now this was about 95 miles east of Paris. In an all-day battle, the legionaries crushed the invaders, killing 6,000 and taking 4,000 prisoners. The Romans lost 1,200. Valentinian then carried the war across the Rhine the following year. And this brings us to the Battle of Sullacanium in 368. Now, Valentinian, he arranged for the assassination of the Alemanni leader Vedicabius. He was determined to settle this problem once and for all. Now he had no resistance until he got to Sullacanium, where a huge Alemanni army was waiting. Now there's no details, everything's kind of speculation, but the Romans defeated them, and for the next several years so thoroughly subdued the Alemanni tribe that, except for a brief flare-up in 378, they remained quiet for 25 years. Now, Emperor Valentinian had to deal with British revolts by the Picts, and down in Africa, a Moorish king, Prince Firm, he rebelled, and these revolts were all subdued. He campaigned successfully against the German tribes of the Quadi and the Sarmatians. And then Valentinian, who was a very successful administrator and soldier emperor, he died in 375. Now, Emperor Valentinian only had that one great battle against the Alemanni, so we don't keep track of any emperors that just have like 1 or 2 battles, great battles. And the actual date that we use to start the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 378, because this is the famous decisive battle of Adrianople. This is a Roman loss. In 378, Valentinian's brother, remember Valens, he's the new emperor, he intends to inflict one final defeat on the barbarians before an army from the Western Empire joins him in his victory. Here we get again, pride just kills these emperors. Now the Visigoths had received permission to settle within Thrace to get away from the Huns that were pushing from the east, but the Visigoths and Romans started fighting in that area. Now, as story goes, all the Visigoths wanted to do was settle within the empire, and Valens, full of pride and prestige and bravado, decided not to let them do that. Now, when they were fighting in that area, Valens responds. He sights a Goth wagon on a low hill, and he deploys his main army behind a screen provided by his cavalry. Now, the Ostrogoth horsemen are out on a foraging run. Now, the Goth chief, Fritigern, he sets the grass on fire and sends out emissaries to gain time for his cavalry to come back. However, the Romans attack once they finish deploying. Now, the Ostrogoth horsemen returned and hit the Roman right and drove the Roman cavalry from the field. The Roman left, unaware what is happening on the right because of the huge dust clouds over the fields, moves on toward the wagons. The Goths move out from the camp, as the cavalry moves in from the right, encircling the Romans, and the Romans break. Valens tries to shore up the legions, but to no avail. By nightfall, the Romans are in full retreat. Valens is killed, and his body is never recovered. Caesar Decius and many senior officers are also killed. It is the worst Roman defeat since Cannae. Some 20,000 of the 30,000 Romans are killed. Now this battle, settles the superiority of the cavalry over the infantry now for the next 1,000 years. The cavalry will be the way that future armies will go. Now the Western Empire never recovers from this blow. The surviving Western Emperor, Gratian, made Theodosius the Eastern Emperor in 379, and between them they tried to limit the damage. The desperate shortage of trained soldiers made it impossible to defeat the Goths. Instead, they were allowed to settle south of the Danube, their social structure intact, in return for providing contingents for the Roman service. They were commanded by their own chieftains and had little cause to trust or even like the Romans. Now this brings us to 394, the Battle of Aquileia. The Western Emperor was forced to abdicate by a usurper. Theodosius the Great, as the history call him, defeated and beheaded the Roman pretender, Magnus Maximus. Now he placed Valentinian II back on the throne. He then took mobile Roman units to the east. No sooner was he back in the east, a new pretender, the pagan Eugenius of Gaul, who drew his support from a Frankish general named Arbogast. For the second time, Theodosius marched out of his capital, Constantinople, to put down the insurrection in the west. He encountered the enemy at Aquileia. Despite a long day of attack, he made little headway against the rebels. On the second day, he crushed his enemy. Eugenius was beheaded, and Arbogast committed suicide. Pagan worship once again became forbidden. Now, this battle reunited the empire once more, but it would be for the last time. Theodosius, who was 2-0 in major battles, both against Roman armies, so the Roman battle record does not improve. He dies the following year, and the empire was divided among his two sons, Arcadia in the east and Honorius in the west. Now, the administrative distinction, culture, and linguistic difference between Greek in the east and Latin in the west, and this difference is easy for historians to separate the east and the west. And at this time, basically, the Roman Empire ceased to be a union with the death of Theodosius in 395, and this will start our 5th century, and you can mark this as the date where the Eastern Empire is now separated from the Western Empire. Now, this brings us to 402 in Pollentia. Now, the Emperor Honorius faced a formidable challenge from Alaric, the king of the Visigoths. Now, Alaric invades Italy from the northeast, and he headed to Milan, where Honorius had established his capital. And you can see from the brown lines here coming from the Balkan area, Alaric heads to Milan. The emperor flees to Ravenna, leaving the defense of Italy to Flavius Stilicho. He was the son of a Vandal chieftain. Now, Stilicho called in troops from Britain and the Rhine and marched toward Milan. At Pollentia, he attacked the Gothic camp while the invaders were celebrating Easter. The Goths fought back savagely, but Stilicho pressed his attack and overwhelmed the defenders, killing thousands of Goths and capturing the German wife of Alaric. Alaric fell back to the north, and Stilicho pursued, but he could not destroy Alaric's main force. Now, in 406, 3 years later, a new invader swarmed over the Alps. These invaders were also Germans, estimated at 100,000, but probably only about 30,000 fighting men. They were under the command of an Ostrogoth named Radagaius, and this would be the orange line on this map. Now, Emperor Honorius held up at Ravenna. The invaders marched to the Arno River. Now, here's a picture of the Arno River. Pretty cool. Now, Stilicho attacked this force and managed to drive off the Germans, pursuing them closely. He surrounded them at Fiesole. The Roman army stormed into the camp and virtually erased all opposition. Radagaius was captured and executed. This brought only 4 more years of peace. The capable commander was murdered in 408. The following year, Alaric again invaded. Now, Stilicho was 3-0 in major battles, and they were all against Alaric, who is 0-3 at this time. But again, now he's gone, murdered by the jealous Emperor Honorius. And this brings us to 410, Battle of Rome, or the Sack of Rome. Now, Alaric took the unguarded Via Flaminia to Rome. For the first time since Hannibal, an enemy army stood outside Rome. Negotiations broke out, but the Roman court from Ravenna was unyielding, and Alaric stormed through the Salarian gate. Here again, the Romans could have dealt, some kind of compromise with the barbarians, allowed them to stay in the empire, just like they should have done at Adrianople, but their pride, their stubbornness, their sense of glory and overlordship ruined them. An orgy of massacre and pillage followed. Alaric moved on to southern Italy, but fell ill and died. Now, the result of the fall of Rome, short of calling it a sack, because there was little material damage, but a great loss of prestige and shock. There was no immediate settlement between the Visigoths, Vandals, Alans, and Romans. But for 410, some historians again have the argument for calling 410 the end of Western Rome. I do not. Now, in 429, the Vandals' most celebrated king was Geiserik, and he crossed into Africa. He soon exerted full control over Africa and became a maritime power. They believed in Arianism, a heretical form of Christianity, and persecuted the Catholic Christians with fanatical zeal. Now remember, like so many barbarian forces, they lacked the necessary skills or equipment to take fortified cities. They relied on sheer numbers. Now, this brings us to the Battle of Hippo Regius in 430. Now, after the Vandal king Geiserik overran much of Africa, he laid siege to the city. Bonifacius, with control of the sea, managed to keep the port city supplied. During the siege, Saint Augustine had died there. Just a special fact there. Now, after 14 months, the Vandals abandoned the siege. So we give this to a Roman victory. Now, this brings us to Attila the Hun. He was king of the Huns from 434 to 453. Now, in 446, Roman Britain made its last known appeal for imperial help. Flavius Aetius, the military commander for Valentinian III, was heavily engaged against other barbarians and would send no help. Britain was now on its own. So the defense of Britain is on its own. Western Rome is barely trying to hang on here. Now, it was inevitable that the Huns' westward expansion, which precipitated the migration of other people, should sooner or later appear in their own persons. They did have contact, with the Romans earlier on. For example, Stilicho had been served by a very faithful Hun bodyguard. Now, Attila, apart from his boastful menaces, must have been a very shrewd commander of ability. Under his rule, the Huns dominated and terrorized wide tracts of Europe and Asia, but their power collapsed after his death. Now, apart from Attila's leadership, the main strength of the Huns, as other barbarians, lies in their sheer numbers, swollen by the addition of many subject people. Now, as one might expect from these people who lived on the steppes, they extensively employed the horse and bow for warlike as well as peaceful purposes. They inundated their horse and shields with gold and stones. Because of their lust for gold, they would usually be willing to refrain from hostilities if offered sufficient amounts of it. Attila inherited from his father a capital city in the Pannonia area with a bathhouse and other Roman luxuries. From here, it enabled Attila to threaten Constantinople and pressure the area. Even though the Eastern Emperor paid him a tribute and gave him land, he knew Attila could not hope to break into Constantinople. Then, as chance would have it, the Western Emperor's sister, Honorius, who had been regulated to a condition of perpetual chastity for past sins, secretly offered herself to Attila. Attila would accept as a dowry half the Western Empire. These terms were rejected, so then he turned his army toward the west. And this brings us to Chalons-sur-Marne, the second battle in 451. The Huns, led by Attila, overran most of the Balkans, exacting a large tribute from Theodosius II, which was ruler of the Eastern Empire. But as he turned west, he sent 40,000 Huns into Gaul on a broad front from Belgium to Metz. Paris was bypassed, but Orleans became under siege. Flavius Aetius, military commander of the Western Empire under Valentinian III, allied himself with a Visigoth king, Theodoric I, who was the son of Alaric. Now the combined armies marched in relief to Orleans and drove the Huns back to the Catalaunian plains. The Romans and Visigoths followed. In June, the Huns fought a pitched cavalry battle on the open plains. The Romans held firm on the wings, but the Alans in the center gave way, endangering the right flank. Here, however, the mounted troops rode down the Hun horsemen opposite them. Theodoric fell in this attack, but his son, Thorsmund, took over. Now Attila, having suffered heavy losses, withdrew to his camp. Then, even though Aetius did not renew the attack, the next day Attila retreated back across the Rhine. So this is a Roman victory for Aetius. Now this brings us to another battle at Aquileia. Now in 452, Attila returned and swarmed through the Alps. Aquileia was stormed, sacked, and burned. Attila was met near Lake Garda by Pope Leo, who dissuaded him from marching south against Rome. The Huns, though not Christians, regarded any religions with awe, and much was due to the personality of Pope Leo. Attila exacted a promise that Honoria, her movable dowry, should be paid. Failing, this will resume hostilities. However, before this could be carried through, Attila suddenly died, having burst a blood vessel on his first night with his new concubine. Now the Huns ceased to be a serious menace after his death. The efforts of the Goths and other Germanic tribes who opposed them caused them to disperse. Aetius, who was a colorful figure, once killed a professional rival in a single hand-to-hand combat. He was killed by Valentinian III, whose jealousy recalls that of Emperor Honorius' jealousy of Stilicho. So here, it just never gets any better here with these emperors killing their rivals when their kingdoms are ready to fall. So this battle of Aquileia was a Roman loss. Now, this brings us to 455. The Battle of Rome again. Now, despite the continued incursion of barbarians into the empire, the Roman court seemed largely concerned about internal conspiracies. We saw that Flavius Aetius, the last great military commander of Rome, was murdered by Valentinian III. 6 months later, Valentinian himself was murdered. A Roman senator, Petronius Maximus, took the throne, and Gaiseric, the Vandal king who won North Africa 20 years before, arrived at the mouth of the Tiber with a large fleet. Meeting little opposition, he reached Rome on June 2nd. For the next 14 days, the city was plundered, far more savage than Alaric's sacking in 410. The work of the Vandals was a new and lasting sack. Maximus was either killed by the Romans or by the ferocious invaders. Pope Leo once again convinced the leader to leave Rome. The Western Empire was now mortally wounded. The Suevian barbarian Resimir stormed the city in 472, but by then the city was virtually defenseless. That's another Roman loss. Now, this brings us to the Battle of Pavia in 476. The Western Empire saw 10 different emperors between 455 and 475. The 10th being the young Romulus Augustus, who was raised to the throne at Ravenna through a military coup by his father, who was basically a former officer in Attila's army. Now, he was almost immediately challenged by another barbarian, Odoacer, of the Heruli tribe. Now, these two barbarian armies clashed at Pavia. Odoacer triumphed, killing Orestes in a 2-day battle. Then he marched to Ravenna and deposed the young Emperor Romulus. Now, this date here marks, for most historians, the end of the Western Empire as we know it. Now, I do not, again, I've talked about that in other videos, a long time ago, years ago, but I do not call it the end. But this is where most historians will mark 476 as the end. Now, what I'm going on to say is the reason I don't mark it is because Odoacer, he sent the insignia of the imperial power to the Emperor of the East. Odoacer was determined to rule the Western Empire under Pope Leo II. However, I contend that even though the Empire in the West ended internally and paternally, it physically continued through barbarian rule, as by example of Odoacer. He kept all the Roman institutions and constitutional trappings intact because he knew that the law and order that were established already was his best chance of power and control. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire came into existence in 395 with the death of Flavius Theodosius I, who had reunited the Roman Empire under his rule back in 394. Because in 474, Zeno the Isaurian became the first ruler in Constantinople to take the name Byzantine Emperor, and he was called this because he named himself after the old city's name, Byzantium. Before, remember, Constantine changed it to Constantinople. Now, the Eastern Byzantine Empire still considered the Western Empire as an outlying province and still considered themselves Romans. And that ends my Roman series. The final battle record was 118 wins, 54 losses, and 4 draws. That's a solid 2-to-1 ratio. So you can see how the Romans did so well, winning that many major decisive battles. And remember, this doesn't include, skirmishes and a lot of the smaller battles or Roman versus Roman battles. And you can see in their history the reason for their success. They had competent military commanders and innovative military tactics and strategies that allowed them to win victory after victory. What could have been if they didn't have so many civil wars? For our military commanders, here's a list. And then I'd like to cite the authorities I used. Roman history is derived from later writers in history because when the Gauls sacked Rome in 390 BC, most of the records were most likely burned. At any rate, written accounts of the calendar year was chiefly the job of the chief magistrates, the Pontifex Maximus. The first Roman historians were usually Roman senators who held public office and were largely patriotic in their history of Rome. Now, the early Roman writers like Quintus Fabius Pictor wrote in Greek, and he took part in the Second Punic Wars. Marcus Corys Cato, he wrote in Latin and made use of early pontifical annual records. His writings were regarded as authoritative and were questioned little by historians in the following century. The work of early annalists were not only used by Romans but by Greek historians who dealt with Roman history. Both Diodorus and Dionysius of Halicarnassus were contemporaries of Livy. Now, the best contents relating to earlier Rome history are best known to us by Livy's work. Of his 142 books, 1 through 10 and 21 through 45 have survived. The rest are gone. Now, apart from excerpts from the rest, his work is made alive by later writers. The Punic Wars give us first-hand accounts as well. Polybius, he wrote the history of Rome's conquest and dominance of the ancient world during the 3rd and 2nd centuries. Out of his original 40 books, only 5 survived, except for some excerpts. King Pyrrhus, Plutarch pulled from Hieronymus of Cardia. His history of successors provided important material for the relevant period in Diodorus' Bibliotheca, as well as Arrian's history of post-Alexandrian events. History of the successor covers the events up until the death of Pyrrhus, and perhaps even later. Now, for Hannibal's war, Livy is, of course, our most extensive authority. Livy's source was Appian and Dio Cassius. Sallust was a historian on the Jugurtha War. Cornelius Sulla, he wrote memoirs as well of his era, and we have evidence of Cicero's speeches from Sulla as well. Many writers preserved Livy's writings, like one Aculius, who was an officer in the imperial army in the 1st century down to 30 AD. Appian, a Greek who lived in Rome and held high posts there, wrote the history of the Roman world. However, the civil wars were distinct. Now, Plutarch's lives are accounts of famous Romans, covers the periods of Pompey and Caesar, and combined with biographies of Pompey, Lucullus, Suetonius, Crassus, Cato, Cicero, and Caesar, is to convey a general picture of political and military events as they unfolded. Now, we have Caesar's Gallic Wars and biography of Caesar by Suetonius. After Caesar's assassination down to Actium, Augustus wrote his memoirs and had Virgil, Horace, and Livy as a generation of writers along with him. So it is said in a lot of their writings in Virgil, Horace, and Livy, because they lived along Augustus, they viewed Augustus in a favorable light. Now we have Pollio. He served under Caesar, then under Antony. He would correct a more one-sided version of Augustus, but his writings did not survive. Appian and Plutarch writings survived in his Life of Antony. Also shedding great light on the politics of this time was Cicero Philippicus, a series of 14 orations in which Antony was bitterly attacked. Tactius, his evidence on contemporary events is important. Being born in 56 and consul in 97 AD, the history's period of 69 to 96, and the annals which span from 14 AD to 68 AD. He also wrote a monograph on the Germans and German people. He wrote a biography of Agricola, his father-in-law, a great general in Britain. Flavius Josephus, he wrote the history of his own country, the Jews, but as well the Judean-Roman War of 66. Later Christian writers, Eusebius and the Bishop of Caesarea in 313, which adds to our understanding of Roman history in the first 3 centuries AD. Now, apart from Eusebius, we have Jerome and Orsius writing at the end of the 4th century about paganism, and Aminius. He wrote under Emperor Julianus the history of Rome in Latin, where the history of Rome by Appian in 96 AD left off. Now, Vigilius Renatus wrote on Roman military techniques, but his chronological history is imprecise.